Here's a list I've been wanting to get to for a while. NES games I hated at the time. There's no rhyme or reason to this list, and it's certainly not meant to be an all-encompassing look at every bad NES game ever made. Instead, I'm just going to reminisce about some of the games that made an initially negative impression on me growing up, and then we'll see if that hate truly was justified or if the game really was a clunker. First up, Deadly Towers. Now, in order to truly wrap your mind around why I would even have played this game as a kid, first let me introduce you to the great little Colonial Pantry, a convenience store gas station type place in the little town of 800 or so that I grew up in. I'll mention the Colonial Pantry several times in this video because it was the only place in a podunk Midwestern small town where a broke little kid could rent NES games in the 80s, and it was even within reasonable walking distance of my house. I don't even think this chain of stores exists anymore, but if you've ever been to a Casey's General Store, it's a lot like that. In fact, Casey's even eventually moved into my little town and put the Colonial Pantry out of business, which is why the only picture I can find of it is one of it being torn down so they could put in another bar. Anyway, the Colonial Pantry had everything a little kid could want. 5-cent gummy worms, slush puppies, yeah, remember those? And a handful of NES games to rent. Of course, this being pre-internet, all you really had to go on was the box art, and the cover for Deadly Towers, looks pretty cool. Worth a shot, right? Deadly Towers was developed by IRIM and released by Broderbund in 1986. Okay, regardless of how this game is remembered now, try and picture this through the eyes of a 7-year-old little kid playing it for the first time. You're all excited and you rent this game where you play as a prince going off on a quest to burn down these 7 deadly towers and defeat the Devil of Darkness himself. And there's some good things going on here. Your character can move around in 8 different directions with an isometric view that wasn't common in games from this era. The music is pretty good, and there's a variety of enemies. The problem is they put all of these enemies on one screen, your character is slow as molasses, and they gave you the weakest sword in video game history. Yeah, it's one of those games where you can barely make it past the first few screens without immediately dying. The game even taunts you with a password system, which gives you a password for the very beginning of the game. Great, I got it, thanks. I never had the patience as a kid to get much further in this game, and as an adult, I have no desire to even try. Top Gun. Now here's a game that brings back memories. Story time, kids. When I first got my NES as a Christmas present from my grandparents, it actually came in the form of 2 wrapped presents. The first was a much larger present and the second a smaller present, which unbeknownst to me at the time just happened to be the exact size of an NES game box. I had been begging for an NES all year after those epic commercials started airing, but had conceded that I was probably just going to be stuck playing Atari games for the foreseeable future. Finally, Christmas rolls around and I see these 2 presents sitting there under the tree. My immediate instinct was to unwrap the smaller present first and then the bigger present, because the biggest present had to be the best, right? So as a little kid, I couldn't understand why my grandparents told me I had to unwrap the larger present first before unwrapping the smaller present. Well, the biggest one was indeed a Nintendo Entertainment System complete with Super Mario Bros., Duck Hunt, and the NES Zapper. That's just fantastic. Thank you, Grandma and Grandpa. Also, I really miss you guys. The second present, Top Gun on the NES. Ah, now it all made sense. So Top Gun ended up being the first additional game I got to play for the NES alongside the packaged Duck Hunt and Super Mario Bros. Games, and my feeling about this game was always a little underwhelming. Okay, so first up, let me just say I didn't necessarily hate this game as a kid. That's a bit harsh. I always felt like the music and sound effects were really good. It doesn't have many tracks, but what Konami did include here was awesome. And the sounds really do make it feel like you're flying an F-14 Tomcat. The simple graphics do manage to create a 3D effect that's very playable. Also, this game is really fun to play if you have an NES Advantage. The turbo controls and joystick lend themselves perfectly to this type of game, and it really makes it feel like you're in the cockpit of a fighter jet. The biggest complaints are typically the refueling sequences as well as the landing sequence. But somehow as a kid I figured out the trick to the landing sequence pretty quick. Okay, so here's what happens. At the end of each stage you have to land your F-14 on an aircraft carrier while your dashboard goes bananas with messages like up, right, left, speed up, speed down, up. These are confusing and typically wrong. Here's what you're supposed to do. If you look toward the bottom, it tells you your alt is supposed to be 200 and your speed should be 288. You've got meters for alt and speed to the right, so just speed up or down accordingly and move the plane's nose up or down until you get pretty close to those readings. Completely ignore the messages on the dashboard and just try to keep the aircraft carrier toward the center of your screen while you're doing all of this, and you should land the plane perfectly every time. The other annoying thing that tripped up most people was the refueling sequence. After the first level, the levels got just long enough to where you'll start to run out of fuel and have to refuel mid-flight. This is frustrating because you only have a limited amount of time to pull it off, or else the refueling plane just leaves and you're stuck playing out the mission till you run out of fuel and crash. I never really could figure out the pattern for this. Sometimes I get it right within seconds, other times I completely screw it up. You just have to do the best you can. Honestly though, my biggest complaint about this game was just the length. It's a really short game. You get 4 missions, the first of which is just training for the next mission. After that, the levels are all a little longer, but they're not at all difficult. Hell, if you just fly straight up, you'll fly over most of the enemies. There's a boss at the end of all but the first stage, but if you just pick the stronger missiles and save those for the end, you'll breeze right through it. Once you get the hang of the landing and refueling sequences, you can get through this whole game in under an hour, and that was my biggest disappointment. After seeing commercials for all of these epic NES adventure games like Legend of Zelda, I got stuck with a short jet fighter game that wasn't much fun to play beyond the first 20 minutes. And speaking of bad Christmas presents, I give you Dr. Mario. I've told this story before on a few live streams, but here it is for those that missed it. There's definitely a theme here. Little kid keeps asking for Legend of Zelda for Christmas and keeps getting something else entirely. By this time, a couple of years had gone by and I still hadn't gotten Legend of Zelda, but there was a very NES game box sized present under the tree this year, so it had to be Zelda, right? Nope. Dr. Mario. I think this is where as a kid I started to get a little more bitter and jaded toward big corporations. I was starting to learn the ways of the world and how big evil corporations dupe unsuspecting parents and grandparents into buying crappy products for their kids by slapping their favorite characters on an otherwise unremarkable package. Okay, so to be fair, Dr. Mario isn't a terrible game at all. It's actually a fairly inventive little puzzle game. Not unlike Tetris, this time you play as a doctor dropping different colored pills onto viruses. Match up 4 colors in a row with a virus to take them out. You can even take out viruses by lining up the colors sideways, which was cool. This game also had an excellent soundtrack that was perfect for chilling out and killing some viruses, and it featured an inventive 2-player mode that allowed you to drop pill parts onto an unsuspecting opponent and completely screw up their day. It's a very well done puzzle game. There's just one problem. It doesn't have anything to do with Mario at all, and there was no valid or otherwise justifiable reason for slapping Mario on the box except to sell some extra copies. You could have just as easily not had Mario and called the game Virus Panic or something, and it's the same game. Having Mario there does nothing. And my grandparents were so excited that they bought me another Mario game, I didn't have the heart to tell them it was just a boring puzzle game with Mario slapped on the box, as I wouldn't want to risk hurting their feelings. So, is this game really that bad? Well, no. It's just that when you want a sweeping 8-bit adventure game like Legend of Zelda and you get stuck with Dr. Mario due to shady marketing, well, it's hard not to be annoyed with this one. CastleVania 2: Simon's Quest. This was another Colonial Pantry special. The cover of this game was so tantalizing. I mean, look at it. It's CastleVania. By now, I'm sure I'd seen the commercials for this game too. This looked like the epic quest I'd been longing for since apparently I was never going to get my hands on Legend of Zelda. So invariably, I'd get this thing home and pop it in the old NES and, okay, cool. It's like we start off in a town here. I'll just go to the left and see what's... Oh, nope. Aw, crap. And that pretty much sums up my whole experience with this game as a little kid. I mean, the criticisms of this game have been done to death, so you know the drill. It's confusing, you don't really know where to go, it takes forever to build up your hearts, which you use to buy stuff, the townsfolk don't really give you any useful clues, the day-to-night transitions are annoying, yada yada yada. So at this point, I was probably 7 or 8 years old. I had a subscription to Nintendo Power at some point in there, but I must not have gotten the issues for this game, so I didn't really know where to go or what to do, and it was a rental, so I didn't even have a manual to work with. And I mean, look, I was all for a non-linear trial and error type of gaming experience. Somewhere a little later on, I got my hands on Shadowgate and and stuff like that, not to mention a few text adventures on computer like Space Quest, so this should have been right up my alley. But it just went way over my head, or I must have caught it at the wrong time and I just wasn't quite ready for it. The weirdest thing is that every few months I'd forget that I had already rented this game. Seriously, so I'd be up at the Colonial Pantry getting myself some gummy worms and a slush puppy. I'd see CastleVania 2 on the shelf and think, holy crap, it's Simon's Quest, I have to rent this. I'd get it home and within 30 seconds I'd remember, oh, yeah, it's that game. I must have done that like 4 or 5 times before it finally sunk in that I actually hated this game. That box art just kept reeling me in. I really wanted to like it. The gothic level design really takes you into the lore of Dracula and Transylvania, and Noriyasu Tagakushi put together an incredible soundtrack, one of the best on the NES. I know there's a ROM hack floating around out there by the almighty guru called The Redaction, which fixes most of the game's bigger issues. At some point I want to do a live stream and play through that whole thing so I can get the true Simon's Quest experience I thought I was going to get some 3 decades ago. Speaking of live streams, this would be a good time to mention, since there are a lot of new faces here, I actually have a Let's Play channel called Friday Night Arcade Plays. These videos are a bit more casual and unedited, just me hanging out playing some random game, old or new, maybe a live stream here or there. There are also a lot of older videos from the channel's early years with my best friend Jason and I playing through random games, old and new. We did a run through several old NES and Super NES titles such as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Super Star Wars, but we also team up and play some modern stuff like DayZ. We also did an entire playthrough of Broforce, a throwback to old school 2D run-and-gun shooters that nearly killed me. So stop by and check out Friday Night Arcade Plays sometime if you want to hang out with me in a more casual setting. Hope to see you soon at Friday Night Arcade Plays.
The Adventures of Bayou Billy.
The Adventures of Bayou Billy. One last treat from the old Colonial Pantry. The box art certainly looked promising enough. The plot of this game isn't complicated. Have you seen Crocodile Dundee? Well, then you've seen The Adventures of Bayou Billy. Swashbuckling, crocodile-wrestling outback guy goes off to save his girlfriend from the stereotypically evil, cigarette-smoking, portly guy with the twirly mustache. There's even an Adventures of Bayou Billy comic book, so you can take the story with you wherever you go. Yes, this is a real thing that actually exists. Anyway, the gameplay is somewhere along the lines of Double Dragon, side-scrolling beat-em-up action, occasionally you pick up a weapon. This should be a no-brainer, but unfortunately this game is insanely difficult. Common enemies take like 179 hits to kill, meanwhile they inflict tons of damage. This game is impossible. My first experience getting this game home as a rental and popping it in probably looked something like this. I made it 2 or 3 screens in before getting pummeled to death and already having to burn up and continue. I tried a couple of times and I think I made it as far as this river section on the first level before I just gave up. I actually walked back up to the Colonial Pantry and tried to exchange it for something else. I think I made up something like the cartridge just didn't work in my NES, and I remember the store clerk just giving me this look like this probably wasn't the first time a little kid tried to return this game. Come to find out though, the Japanese version of this game is actually 10 times better. In Japan, this game was called Mad City, and it's basically the same game, but before Konami enacted the make the game preposterously difficult to beat policy for its US release. Also, the box art for Mad City looked way more like Crocodile Dundee. But anyway, holy crap, this game is actually really fun. There's gun stages, driving stages, the action is solid and the gameplay is pretty smooth. The enemies occasionally even drop health or a bulletproof vest to help you out. You get a whip like Simon Belmont and CastleVania. I never saw any of this crap when I rented the game 30 years ago. Heck, just seeing the second stage blew my mind. Just wow. So you basically spend the whole game pummeling, driving, and shooting your way through this guy's henchmen until you get to blast your way into his mansion and rescue your girlfriend. There's a few tougher enemies to beat along the way, sure, but the challenge is honest and not stupid. There's some really good music along the way. You can get through it in about an hour or so, and the conclusion is satisfying. Huh. I never thought I'd see the ending of this game. What did you think? What were some of the games you hated growing up? Were they really as bad as you remember, or were you just expecting something else? Did you ever try returning a game to the rental store because it was so bad? As always, thank you for watching. Please don't text and drive, and I'll see you next time on Friday Night Arcade.